Good morning, nerds. We are going to continue our first-person shooter tutorial today. This is, I think we're on installment 6, and this one is all going to be about the enemy firing bullets. We've already gotten our player firing bullets. We've gotten the enemy taking damage. I haven't decided, we'll see how long this recording goes. I haven't decided whether we're going to fold player taking damage into this tutorial. That will involve making an HP bar very, very similar to how we did it with the enemy. But we can definitely get the enemy shooting during the course of this tutorial. As always with these tutorials, it's very important that you are working with a current version of the project. If you have not yet completed the previous tutorials, it's very, very important that you do those before starting this one. Specifically, the enemy pathfinding must be working correctly before we start this step, because otherwise the enemy won't be able to track the player. We're going to start off by solving this as a series of tasks, and each time we're going to get more and more specific, because the player, the enemy is going to we're going to have to code the enemy behaviors to be delayed. Very, very similar in nature to how we had to, when we first fired with the player, we had the bullet shooting going on almost a machine gun basis. Like if I just held down the mouse button, it would fire a slurry of bullets. And we really don't want that in our actual project, because over time, that enemy is just going to be able to throw thousands and thousands of bullets, literally 60 per second. And we can't rely on what we did with the player, which was resolve it down to a mouse click. The enemy doesn't have a mouse to click, and we certainly don't want to make it so that the player is in control of the enemy's bullets. So we're going to add some delay timers into that. So what we're going to start off with, in order for the enemy to fire, and this is going to look very, very familiar compared to what we did with the player, is we are going to need to set up the enemies where the bullets come from. And we could, again, like last time, kind of target the gun for that, but we want to avoid doing that, because if we target the gun, we're going to have some issues with, sorry, I'm also not able to drag again, and I was able to just a second ago. I don't know why it keeps doing that. Anyways, so the enemy prefab is going to need to be able to fire a gun. And we're going to need to know where that bullet is going to come from. So we're going to start off pretty basic here. We're going to go back into that enemy prefab, and we're going to do a little bit of editing. This isn't going to look too different from what we've done before. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lock in on that guns cube. This is exactly what we did with the player. I'm going to lock in on the guns cube, and we're going to right click and say create empty. And you'll notice that is nested and parented to the gun. I'm validating that it is zeroed out, which it already is. But if yours isn't zeroed out, now's a good time to do that. And just to make this convenient so we understand what it is, I'm going to name my object bullet spawner over here on the left. And just like last time, what we're going to do is we're just going to drag it out. We're going to leave it oriented at the center of the gun, but we're going to drag it out to the tip. And again, we're making sure that that Z-axis is facing in the same direction that the gun is. And so if we look out there, and it's just zoomed in, if I zoom in a bit, just like last time, and the specific values don't really matter here as long as it's visible, is we've got a little bit of a gap here between the gun and the bullet spawner. We could very, very easily make that, perfectly fit at exactly a value of 0.5. That would make it a perfect seam. But again, for some various collision-related reasons and things like that, it actually works a little bit better if it's pulled out just a little bit. So now that we've got that, what we're going to do is we can now make use of that bullet spawner object, and we've done this a couple times before, so if you've gotten this far, this has to be working, but I also need to validate that I do indeed have a bullet prefab, and just like last time, it does need to still be tagged bullet on the layer bullets. That shouldn't have changed, and if you have gotten this far without that, then we've probably had some other problems, but just it's worth calling out. All right, so now that we've got that going, our next project is going to be to start messing with code. And fortunately for us, on the code level, really, it's going to match and be very, very similar to exactly what we did with the player. So I'm going to kind of swing down here in the player script to our get mouse button down 0. But first off, I'm going to go into my enemy, and we're gonna do a little bit of editing here. I'm going to add public game object bullet spawner. I'm going to try to spell it correctly. Bullet spawner. And just like our previous game objects, we are going to set that up in the inspector later. Now I'm going to go ahead and scroll down, and I'm going to find basically in my update code, I'm going to go down just below or just above, and actually, well, yeah. I'm going to go right before I start doing my turning. I could do it after. It doesn't really matter. These are all distinct chunks of code. So as long as you kind of go either before or after or during a chunk, or as long as you're between chunks, you're okay. But I wouldn't be able to do it, like, for example, in the inside of an if statement. But we're just going to kind of grab this spot right here. So after we've already navigated towards the player before we're doing this turning, the order honestly is not going to matter that much in the long run. And this is going to be my spot where I'm going to say, hey, fire a bullet. Okay, and what we're going to do here is we're just going to copy in the player script. We have these 2 lines of code, and these spawn a bullet, attach it to our bullet spawner, and launch it in the same direction that the bullet spawner is facing. And all of that is working pretty well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tap into that. I'm going to go ahead and copy that with a Control-C. And I'm just going to paste it in right there. And honestly, this is about all we need to do. Oh, I forgot to create a bullet game object. So I am getting this error here. We do need to fix that. But everything else is looking pretty good. And honestly, this is the code that we need. And there's nothing actually wrong with this bullet here. This is good. But the mistake I did make was that I forgot to add a bullet game object up above. So we're going to go public game object bullet. That's going to give me something to spawn. It's just like what we did on player. And the other thing, no, I'm not gonna worry about that for now. Okay, so we're in pretty good shape. The other thing I can consider doing here is deciding whether or not I want to allow my enemy script to control the damage and speed of the bullet, whether or not I want to put that in the inspector or not. And there's some pros and cons. Ultimately, I do want to get to the point where the player is able to grab different guns. And I still haven't really decided if I want the enemy to be able to do the same. In some first-person shooters, they can pick up weapons, especially if the NPCs are meant to emulate the player's behavior. And in some games, they can't. So this is a decision that we kind of need to make. For now, I'm going to assume that I get to make decisions about the NPCs. So I'm going to go ahead and add 2 variables. I'm going to go public, let's do int for this, is going to be gun damage, and public float bullet speed. And these are going to be values that I can pass in on an enemy to alter my speed and damage of the bullets. And so that's going to be some alterations that we're going to make. So I'm going to go ahead and use these values. And you're going to notice that I've broken down my variable section. So I've got some HP related stuff. I've got some bullet related stuff. I've got some nav mesh related stuff. So I'm really kind of using my white space to help me separate what's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and take this bullet, gun damage and bullet speed, and we're going to integrate those. And honestly, this is not going to be that much work because our functions are already kind of built to deal with this. My 10 here represents the enemy's, or I'm sorry, excuse me, the bullet's speed. So we're going to go speed. I'm going to start typing that in because I don't remember exactly what I called those variables. Oh, bullet speed. And it does show up in my list here, so I can select it. And then I'm going to do the same thing here with bullet damage. Of course, I didn't list it there. Gun damage. There's -1 points to Jim for inconsistency in my naming, but it's still going to work, so this is okay. All right, so we've got all of that working, and really this should be enough. Like, this should actually work out pretty good. If I save, the only problem I'm going to have now is the fact that I haven't set those values in the inspector. And I have not yet linked up the bullet spawner and the bullet in the inspector. So if I do run it right now, I am going to get some errors. Let's just validate that. But we are definitely going to see some errors here. So if I run my game, sure enough, Unity is screaming at me about bullet spawner not being set, and it isn't even getting to the fact that the bullet's not set yet. But we already kind of knew that that was going to happen. So I'm not too worried about those errors right now. I'm going to go back into my enemy prefab. I'm going to find my enemy script. And we're going to go ahead and set some of those values. So gun damage was 20 last time we did this, so I'm going to go ahead and make it 20 this time. We were using a bullet speed of 10, so I'm going to just go ahead and continue that. And we're going to grab our bullet spawner and drag it into bullet spawner. And then we're going to grab our bullet prefab and drag it into bullet. At this point in time, we've correctly assembled our enemy, and we are doing good. At this point, I think we should be able to run without errors. So we're going to validate that real fast. And sure enough, here he is, and he is just firing a ton of bullets at me. Now, they're not really doing much because I don't have hit points, so I am functionally immortal. So I guess I could fire back now and not worry too much about the damage that he's doing to me. But definitely he is firing a lot of bullets, and we really don't want him machine gunning that badly. If you do like him machine gunning that badly, later on when we put a firing delay in, you can set your delay to 0.16 seconds, and that will give you essentially the same result, or I'm sorry, excuse me, 0.16 seconds, and that will give you the exact same result because that is basically the number of milliseconds in a frame. All right, so now that we've got all of that done, it is time to slow the bullets down a bit. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to see if I can get him only firing on an interval. So we want to slow down his shots. And the reason I'm choosing that one first is the other one we want to do is sight detection. And I don't really want to do that first because then it'll be harder and take longer to test to see if we've got his firing delay working. So we're going to go ahead and implement a firing delay next. Now that we have him firing all the bullets all the time, very, very quickly, it's time to let him slow that down a little bit. So we're going to go back into our code in enemy script. And this is something we will eventually add to the player as well. But for now, we're not going to worry about that. Is in our gun section, we're also going to add two new variables. We're going to add a firing delay. So public float firing delay. And that's going to represent the value, and we're going to set it for now. We have to, again, think in terms of like if how many times do we want to fire per second? And what kind of a delay is that? So the bigger that I make this delay, the slower bullets will fire because it's the time in between the shots, not my number of shots. And I feel like I'm going to say about 3 shots per second is going to feel pretty good to me for now, at least for testing purposes. And we can always speed it up or slow it down from there. So if I want to think about this in terms of 3 per second, that means I need to shoot one every 1/3 of a second. 1/3 is 0.33 repeating. So we're going to do 0.333F. And that is more than enough mathematical precision for this operation. At this point, we're not going to notice, a millionth of, or actually at this point, we're down to about 100th of a second. We're not going to notice anything in that level of distance. Actually, we're down to the thousandths already, so that's pretty good. Okay, so now we are ready to. Now this is great. This is going to give us our delay, but what we aren't doing yet is having a variable that will keep track of how long it's been since I fired. So this is the amount of time I want to wait, but I'm not tracking how long it's been. So we need to add a variable for that. So we're going to go public float, and we're just going to call this one firing delay left. And there's 2 possibles here. We could do something like what we did with HP, where we just set it equal to firing delay on start, and that would auto reset it every time. But honestly, I'm going to set it to 0 here, and the reason I'm going to set it to 0 is I'm going to assume that any armed combatant is entering the battlefield with a shot loaded and ready to go. You know, if I'm going to show up for a war, I'm not going to like bring in my rocket launcher and be like, oh crap, I haven't loaded it yet. So we want it to already be loaded for that very, very first shot. So we're going to leave this at 0 delay left. That means the enemy will be able to fire right away, but then after that, we're going to have reload time. So this is a good setup. In our update, the very, very first thing that we're going to do in update from now on, and again, I'm still an enemy, is we're going to decrease the amount of firing delay left. And we've done this a couple times. We've referenced the clock. We're going to decrease it by time.delta time. So we're going to go firing delay left. Again, that's our time remaining before we can fire again, minus equals time.delta time. And that's going to give us, that's going to decrease our firing delay by the amount of time that's passed since the last time we've asked this question. Which should be about 0.016 seconds on average per tick. So that's going to be pretty good. But again, once that hits 0 or less, we're going to go ahead and be able to fire. Once we've done that in our fire a bullet, we only want to fire a bullet if we're allowed to. So before we fire a bullet, we're going to add a couple more lines here of white space. And we're going to say, hey, has the timer expired? Has my bullet timer worn out? Okay, and again, I'm just doing a comment. It doesn't matter exactly, you know, you don't have to use my specific questions as long as you're leaving yourself a note like this is what this code is for. And the code for this is really simple. We're going to do if firing delay left is less than or equal to 0, meaning my delay is gone. I am, you know, ready to fire. My timer is up, and so we're good to go. We're going to do an open curly brace here, and we're going to come down after we've fired the bullet to a closing curly brace. And we're going to go ahead and check that. So we're going to go ahead and save this, and we're going to see how we did. So if we run this, we're going to go ahead and stop and start again because we need to let that code kick in. And we can see here in our enemy area, we're at 0.133, and he is coming around, and he is really just still knocking it out with those bullets. What I'm not seeing is my firing delay left is not decreasing, and I'm actually not sure why because I thought I did that correctly. But I am stuck at 0, and because I'm stuck at 0, he is still just firing away at me. So we're going to go ahead and stop that code. We're going to take a look and see what happened here. The first thing I want to do is double check, did I make it a float, which I did. Firing delay left minus equals time.delta time. Firing delay left is less than or equal to 0. All of that actually looks pretty good. So now I'm confused because I thought I had actually done this correctly. So we're going to try this again. I want to look at my enemy. Oh, I'm in the enemy prefab. That's why. Okay, so if we look at our actual enemy, there we go. He's still firing, but you're going to notice that that countdown timer is doing actually what it's supposed to be doing. It's counting down, and that's why the negative value is increasing. It started at 0, but it is definitely counting down, and it's roughly matching the number of seconds that have elapsed since the game time. So it's been about 29 seconds since I started this ramble. So we need to figure out why that number isn't resetting itself. And that is really the answer to this problem. It's not resetting itself because we didn't reset it. So what we need to do here is after we've fired a bullet, we're saying, hey, only fire if the bullet or if the delay is less than 0. And we do decrease the delay, but we never increase the delay. We never reset that timer. So what we need to do is add another line after we fire our bullet and after we do our initialization. And right here, we're just going to say firing delay left equals firing delay. And that's just going to reset that number back to its starting point. So what we should see now, this one should be correct, in that we are going to do we should see a lot slower pulse. And actually, I can just kind of watch it in the inspector here. Those bullets are still flying pretty quick, but we are definitely getting a lot fewer bullets than we were getting before. So that's pretty good. So the last problem that we have is he's firing like just all the time. He's just running around. He's doing a run and gun. And really what we want him to only do is shoot when he has a target. So he can shoot up to 3 times per second as long as he can see something. So the next thing that we've got to do is we've got to mess with what's called a rigid body. And this can get a little bit complicated. So I'm going to be using my reference code here. But basically a rigid body, excuse me, not a rigid body. We need to use a raycast. It does interact with our rigid bodies, but we're going to use a raycast for this. And a raycast is essentially a physics option where we fire an invisible beam from one object kind of in a direction, wherever we want to go, and we check to see if it interacts with anything along the way. And we can do a lot of other stuff, like we could make a firing range so like it's only if we see them at this range. We can, and we can also check to see what we're seeing in front of us. So we're going to use this raycast system. And raycasts can get complicated. We're going to do a very, very simple application of a raycast, so we're not going to get it too complex. But this is a topic, we could do a tutorial series on raycasts alone, just because of how cool they are and what all their capabilities are. So what we're going to do here is, the other thing about a raycast is it's somewhat expensive. So we don't want to do them often. So what we're going to do is we're going to do it only if that delay has gone. So at most, we should only be firing about 3 of these a second, as opposed to trying to fire one off every single frame. That's going to reduce our overhead. It's still not a perfect solution. I'm not a giant fan of raycast being used in game objects for update cycles, just because they are a little memory intensive, but there's not too many other good options for this. So we're going to use raycast kind of because we have to. But there are some other ways to do this that are a little cleaner and that give us a little bit better results. They just take a lot more code to implement, and it's out of scope for this tutorial. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and add a raycast. The things that we're going to need to do here is we need to set up a variable. Raycast will generate hit data. That basically tells me, it'll give me the colliders and some game object data, and it'll basically let me know what I hit with that raycast. So we need to create a variable for that. So we're going to do raycast hit, and we're just going to call it hit. And most tutorials you're going to see that involve raycast just use that as their naming convention. So we almost always, hit is a pretty standard variable name for this. And now that isn't doing anything. That's just giving us a variable to store our data in. Now we need to generate some. The other cool thing about a raycast is that it is what we call a Boolean function. It's going to return a true/false value. So we can just call the function inside of an if statement. If it hits something, it's going to process the code. If it doesn't hit anything, then kind of the story stops there. So we're going to go ahead and do an if statement. Raycast is part of the physics library, so we're going to do if raycast or physics.raycast. And we do have, there are 16 different versions of a raycast. The one that we're going to be doing is going to use some vectors here. So we're going to do for the overload that we're using, the very, very first thing that we need to put in is where does that raycast start? And keeping in mind that we are in the enemy script, so we are the enemy. We want to start it from our center of mass. And technically we ought to probably do it from like our eyeballs or something like that, maybe that faceplate, whatever. But for simplicity's sake, we're just going to fire a laser out of our chest, out of our center of mass, and see if that laser can see the player. If it can, then the player's in front of us. Presumably we would be able to see it with our eyeballs too, if that were the case. So we're going to start this at transform.position because it is our position as the enemy. And then we need to give it a direction. So we're going to give it the direction for this overload. We're going to give it the direction that we're facing. We do need to do a quick little transformation with that. And there's a built-in function that's going to handle that. So we're going to go transform.transform direction. And that is a function, so we're going to do vector3 dot forward. And that's going to give us our forward angle. And then in order for that, and that is going to give us some data back. So after that, we're going to do out hit. And that's going to allow us, I'm trying to get that all on one screen at a time. That's not going to work. So I'm going to drop a line break right here to make it easier for you guys to read at home. But basically, this is all one line of code. It's okay if you do a line break as well. It'll still work, but it's meant to be one line. But basically what this is going to do is if we hit, first off, it's going to return true to the if statement, so the if statement will process. And also, it's going to dump all of the data it found into our hit variable. That's what out hit means. It says, hey, direct all the output from this into the hit function, or into the hit variable. Okay, so we're going to do a curly brace here because that's going to be inside of our if statement. I deleted the closing curly brace and we're going to put it after our firing delay. So the idea here is, and you'll see that that moved all my code. The idea is now, if the firing delay goes off, then we're going to do this raycast stuff. If that's true, then we fire the bullet. If the firing delay isn't true, we won't even attempt this raycast. So it's kind of nice having these things nested inside of each other because it's going to guarantee that things happen in a specific order. Okay, inside of that, we need to get a little more specific. So in this case, the bullet will only fire if he sees something. I'm going to go ahead and save this, but we already know, I already know it's not going to work exactly the way we want it to. So if I run this, what you're going to notice here is, I'm going to see if this is apparent. It's probably not going to be too noticeable. You're going to notice that he did fire some bullets when he wasn't supposed to, and he's firing right now, even though he can't see me, he's still firing, but then he'll go through some periods where he doesn't. And it's really kind of hard to tell this. I'm going to see if I can get over here. So he's not going to fire if he doesn't see me against the world, because there's nothing out there. But as I start to move closer to a wall, he is going to start firing more or less all the time because there is something in front of him. There's a wall in front of him, and that raycast is hitting the wall. So what we need to do is check and see, is the thing that you just hit me or the player? Okay, so this raycast, we need to verify the hit information and see if the hit is on a player, because it might just be a wall, it might be a bullet, later on it might be a health pickup. We don't know what we're looking at yet. So in here we're going to add another if statement. So there's going to be 3 nested ifs, one inside of another. This is like a little if duckin'. We're going to do a if the collider. So we need to figure out if the tag is player. Hit does not have a tag, so we can't check the tag to see if that's a player, like what we did with the bullets earlier. But kind of like the bullets, we can get more information. And so we can do hit dot collider is going to give us the collision data of the thing we hit. And we've already know from our previous experiments with bullets that colliders contain game objects. So we can do game object, and a game object has a tag. And so that's a roundabout way to get to where we need to go. Fortunately for us, this is a fairly processor performant way to do it. So it doesn't take us a whole lot of processor power to go that deep in our layers. So this is still pretty efficient. And if that tag is equal to player, then we actually want to fire our bullet. So we're going to do another curly brace around those things. Now our bullet firing is 3 layers deep, but we are now really specific on our data. And I'm going to go back and add some comments before the raycast. I'm going to say if I can see, or can I see something? And we're going to put that in quote here. Can I see something? And then here we're going to say, is something the player? Okay, so now we're getting more specific as we drill down into that if statement. Okay, can I see anything? Is that anything the player? And now if we go ahead and save this, the player is going to, or the enemy is going to be a lot more specific about his shooting. He's going to be a lot more intentional about that shooting. And so if we start running the game now, what we're seeing is in the inspector, I'm not seeing any bullets being fired until he's finally turned around and facing me. And as soon as I get out of his range, he stops firing. But now that I'm back in his range again, he's firing again. And now I'm close enough to his turning radius. I don't think I'm going to be able to get him to stop firing at me at this point. But we did get our proper detection, and he is only firing a couple of bullets per second, just like we wanted. So this is really doing pretty good. I'm pretty happy with where we're at right now. This has been a relatively short tutorial so far, so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go ahead and try to add the player taking damage now. The player taking damage is really pretty easy, and we're going to try to integrate that with a hit point bar. And because this is basically the same exact technique that we used in the previous tutorial where the enemy took damage, we can move through this one pretty quickly. Basically, I'm going to take, I'm actually going to just cheat a little bit. The enemy has an HP max bar. So I'm going to go in here and I'm just literally going to copy this. And then I'm going to go into my player prefab and I'm going to go to my capsule and I'm going to paste this as a child. And now I have an HP max bar and it's already there. And really all I need to do now is look and go, does that look right? And it sure does. It looks like it's at a pretty good height. It looks a lot like mine. And I'm going to just tinker with the scale here real fast and just kind of validate that it does that. Like if I do 0.8, is that going to, oh, I'm on the wrong bar. I'm on the parent bar, not the child bar. So we're going to put that back to a 1. But we want to make sure that that like red effect from it shrinking actually works. So I'm going to change the X scale manually here. Again, we're going to do like 0.8 and it sure did shrink. We'll try 0.6. It shrunk even more. So it looks like my HP bar is in pretty good shape. So we're going to go ahead and set that back to 1. And we're basically ready to take damage. So being able to copy paste objects is really handy. So I'm going to go ahead and backtrack out of player. That's fantastic. I'm pretty happy with where we're at. And if I double check my player, look at that. He's got a health point bar and we can see it. So we're in really good shape here. The next thing that we're going to do is more copy paste. This is a pretty easy, again, this is a very, very easy script set to work on. So we are going to do some things here. We want to set things up to be like our enemy. So I am going to copy paste my way through a lot of this. The very, very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy my code for HP max and HP. And the main reason I'm doing it via a copy paste is so that I can not accidentally make any typos. I'm using the same case, I'm using the same punctuation, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. So Control C. I'm going to switch to my player script. I'm going to go up to variables area. I'm going to kind of give it some room, paste that in. And then the other thing that we're going to need to do is we are going to need the HP bar. So I'm going to grab my code for that as well, copy paste it, and drop it down here. So we're in pretty good shape. This is a lot of what we need. I'm going to go into my start function. I could copy paste this, but honestly, my odds of messing it up are not that big. And I can probably type this faster than I can copy it. So I'm just going to say HP equals HP max. And there we go. So our basic HP setup is good. Now what we need to do is we need to acknowledge collision and take some damage. Fortunately for us, again, this has all already been done for us. If we go to the bottom of the enemy script, we have public void or private void on collision enter, and we have a take damage function that we wrote. Both of these together are good. So what I'm going to want to do is start at the top here with on collision enter. I'm going to highlight, and you're going to notice that I need to get the entire take damage function, which means I need to get its curly brace. So I really need to end about here. I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way up. So I've copied everything from that curly brace. Note that I'm not taking the class curly brace with me, just the function curly brace. I'm going to take that curly brace all the way up through on collision enter. I'm going to copy that code and I'm going to paste it after the update function, but before the class is over. So I'm going to drop it. I'm going to do a couple line breaks there to give me some room, and I'm going to paste it in. And so this is right below my update function. But before the class finishes, and there's my 2 functions. And guess what? That is actually all we need to do here. And if I go ahead and save this, there's only one thing that I haven't done yet, and that is I need to set the HP bar. So I'm going to go into my player prefab, and we are going to take that HP, the HP current bar. We're going to drag it into our HP bar in our script. I don't know why my prefab, maybe I did it wrong when we were setting things up, but I'm just now noticing that I don't have my bullet spawner set up here in the prefab. I may have just done that on the object in the hierarchy, and that's not okay. So I'm going to fix that while I'm here. I'm going to add my bullet, and I'm going to add my bullet spawner all to my prefab, which I should have done last time, and obviously I've made a mistake in there, but that's okay. We fixed it. Now that's good. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and go back. We're going to go ahead and play our game. And what we should start seeing is if the enemy hits us, I'm not really happy about how much that's blocking us. But if the enemy hits us, we are indeed taking damage. And this is actually good news, but we are getting a lot of problems here. We've killed our display. And also, if we look at our console right now, we are just chugging up the errors. And the enemy is really losing its mind over this operation. So there are some things that we need to fix here. And the main problem that we're having now is by deleting the player, we've caused 2 problems. Number 1, the main camera for our scene is attached to that player. And so by deleting the player, we've deleted the camera, and now the scene just doesn't know how to even render itself. So that's a pretty big problem. The other problem is the enemy can't find me because I don't exist. So he's hunting for me, but I'm not there. So we need to fix that. Fortunately, all of the enemy errors are very, very easy to fix. There's actually a series of problems that are happening here because the enemy update function relies on finding the player. We've actually fixed some of this. We've done if player is not equal to null, and I made some mistakes when I set this up. I should have been using these functions to begin with. So we have this if player is null else, and I made a mistake because I forgot that I had already put this in. I've done this tutorial about 4 different times with my various classes, and I'm trying to do it on YouTube at the same time. So I've lost track of my own stuff. But basically, this else code, we need to include our firing delays and all of our raycast hits and everything else basically inside of this if player is not equal to null. And so at this point, the best solution to this is really just to move this curly brace and this else and its relevant statements down a bit. So I'm going to take this closing curly brace and the else and find the new player. And I'm just going to go ahead and cut that using Control X. I'm not deleting it, I'm cutting it. Because that'll let me paste it in a second because I'm moving it, I'm not getting rid of it. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that. Again, Control X. And I'm basically going to go down to the bottom where I finish looking for the player via rotation. And I'm going to paste all that right here instead. And that did mess up my curly braces, but I'm in good shape. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fix all this. My indentation is completely bonkers right now. But I'm going to fix that by taking this last curly brace that represents the update function's ending. I'm going to delete it and put it back. And that has the net effect of re-indenting everything accordingly. And so now my structure and my organization is back to where it should be again. And that's one of my favorite tricks in Visual Studio is just using that to line things up. So now we're only going to be hunting for things if the player is found, which also means that this nest here for this game object is now 4 deep because we're saying, hey, if the player is not null and my firing delay to left and my physics hits something and that something is the player, then I can go ahead and fire a bullet. So it's a lot more complicated, but this is giving us way better results. And again, it'll also only allow us to turn if the player is on the board. Which is good because we can't turn towards something that doesn't exist. So we go ahead and save that. and we can run, and this should solve all of our actual game errors. The remaining things that we have wrong, we really are having two problems left. One is a major problem of this camera not rendering problem. We're going to fix that in a moment. But we also have this, like, I can't see through my HP bar, and honestly, that is more occlusion than I want to deal with. So what I think I'm going to do here with the HP bar is I think we're going to move it kind of into a different position relative to the player. So what I'm going to do here, it was fun having it up above the player, but I think I'm going to put it more down in this area so we can still see it, but it's more in the bottom of the screen where it's not going to annoy me. So we're going to go ahead and stop our game, and I'm going to just kind of reference the main camera pretty often here. But I'm going to grab the player bar, and I really want to kind of put it maybe where my butt is here. I mean, the player doesn't really have a butt, but it kind of has a butt. So we're going to grab that HP main bar here, and I'm just going to drag it kind of down and kind of back. So now it's kind of coming out my back a little bit. And then I'm going to click on the camera again and just see how we're doing. So there's the camera. Apparently I moved that a little too low because now I can't see it. So we're going to grab the HP bar again. We're going to kind of just drag it up a little bit. Look at our camera. That's actually not too bad, but I think we'll go up just a little bit more. I'm still not really happy with that positioning. So really at this point, it's just kind of a matter of finessing the position here. That looks pretty good. So it is taking up a good chunk of my screen. It almost looks like I've got a little backpack on him. We almost have diegetic UI going, but this is looking pretty good. It's still registering hits on me. And we still do have the display error, but at least now I can see my hit points, but in a much less obtrusive way than it was a second ago. I could also opt to just put this into the UI, maybe make the HP bar go up here or something, but I kind of like it being near the player so I can see it in my vision rather than having to look, you know, in weird spots of the UI to try to find things. So this is pretty good. I'm happy with it. So the last thing we need to deal with is this camera error. And that's the last thing we're going to fix today before this tutorial is over. So the basic problem here, we've already kind of outlined it, is the player has a camera. But the challenge is if we destroy the player because the player died, the camera is going to die with them. And we need that camera to survive. Now, the easy answer here would be to move the camera off the player, but if I do that, then it won't follow the player and I won't really have this first-person vision that I'm looking for. And so really what I want to do here is I want to mess with, basically what I want to do is change the parent of the camera right before I destroy the player, so that way it doesn't get taken along with me. Now, there's, again, as always, there's about 80 different ways to do this. But the easy one for me is right now, technically, the player is parented to something. Normally we think of parents as our objects in our scene and stuff inside of those, but really the scene is actually the parent for all of my other objects. And for this, that's really important. Although the scene doesn't have a transform and doesn't have some of these other things, it is an object parent. So what we can do here is in our player's code, and we need to make sure that we're in player for this. This is player, not enemy. This is player. If we die before we destroy our game object, so HP is less than or equal to 0, we are destroying the game object. Right before that, what we're gonna do is we're gonna yeet the camera. And so we're gonna create a variable for this. We're gonna go public game object, my cam, and that's going to represent our camera. We will need to connect that in the inspector later. But now we can do mycam.transform.parent, and we need to set it to something else. So right now, the transform parent is us, the player. But we need to set it to the player's parent, or the sample scene, the scene itself, which happens to be the player's parent, which allows us to do a really nice cheat because we can just say our transform.parent and the camera will move right before we die. And that's it. It's just that one simple line of code. If we do file save all, we do need to make sure that we set the camera, and this is actually a little bit different than normal. We cannot set this one on the player prefab. We have to do it on the player object in the inspector because the prefab doesn't have access to the things in the hierarchy. It only has access to things in assets. So we do need to do it right here, but the player does have a camera variable, myCam. We can drag in the main camera right there, and there we go. Now that myCam is set, again, we're gonna go ahead and get ourselves killed here. Enemy is gonna shoot at us, our HP bar goes down, and now we have been deleted. And you can see that the enemy is just sitting there chilling. But we are not getting any error messages. The camera is still intact. Everything is basically good. At this point, we actually have a functional first-person shooter. If I wanted to make things more challenging, I don't want you to do too many of these because we are going to get rid of these in the next tutorial if you have created any. But we can actually now, just by using simple duplication, if I do Control D or Apple D if you're on a Mac, I can do duplicates, kind of like what we did with prefabs, and I can create some additional enemies, and they're all just going to work. We don't have to do a whole lot of technical things here. I'm just going to kind of place some enemies around the map. Again, I'm not going to go too crazy. I've already gone crazier than I really wanted to. But now I have quite a few enemies to fight. I do have to be careful because they can kill me, and I'm not terribly good at this game, but there are a lot of them. They're hunting me, and they are able to actually track me. So there's a lot of bullets flying, and I was destroyed. It looks like I did some damage. I did take a few with me, but this is a pretty tough game. It'll be a little bit easier when I get on a controller instead of keyboard inputs. But it's definitely a difficult one. We will be adding some power-ups. At this point, we could also cut the enemy's damage down a little bit. We can make some different game modifications to make this a little bit more fun. But the point is that base functionality is done, and it's really just a matter of level design and setting up our scenarios now. I can design, place my enemies in different spots. I can do some other different things here. So what I am going to do before we close out on this tutorial, because I want us kind of clean for next time, is I am going to go ahead and delete I'm going to leave my original enemy, but I am going to delete all of his little clones that we've created just now. That was really fun to demonstrate, hey, this thing works, but I'm going to delete them for the moment and be done. The other thing I could be doing here is creating some additional walls, but remember, to create a better layout. But remember that if you add new walls, you do need to go back to your navigation mesh and reset and add those back into your objects as non-walkable objects, and then rebake your mesh. So do be careful if you decide to take up that option and you're like, oh, I want to do this. That looks cool. You will need to rebake. So, this is a great opportunity to do some of that stuff, but there we go. In our next installment, what we're going to be working on is we're going to make an enemy spawner so that enemies appear more often, and then we're going to make that actually an attackable target. So I'm kind of picturing this like the enemies coming out of the void or whatever, and we can shoot and destroy that portal, and then kill all the enemies that are left on the board, and that's kind of how we win the game. So that's going to be our next installment. We are also going to be adding some other things like health pickups, the ability to change some guns, etc. But pretty much all of our next steps are all polish related. We're just going to be improving the basic game, trying to make things a little bit better, trying to make things more engaging. But our base core functionality is done. That's it. We're done with making this thing work. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. We hope to see you back next time. If you enjoyed this, as always, please hit like and subscribe. And as always, in closing, keep on creating. Have a great day, everybody.